The men who rode toward Anna Alre that January morning thought they were heading into another grave. The blizzard had already taken lives across the Dakota Prairie. Iron stoves had gone cold. Families had burned furniture, floors, anything that could catch flame, and still people froze in their homes. Some were found only steps from their doors, their bodies swallowed by the whiteout. When the rescue party reached Anna's tar paper shack, they saw no smoke rising at all. No sign of life. No warmth. Just a thin shanty hunched under the weight of drifts, walls rattling in the wind. They expected tragedy. But when they pushed against the snow and forced the door open, warm air rolled out like summer. A widow with no wood, no coal, 3 children under 10, 40 below outside, and yet the floor beneath their boots radiated heat. The children played on the dirt floor, laughing as Anna calmly baked rye bread beside a massive whitewashed clay stove. Men who thought they had seen everything stopped in silence. How? One whispered. Anna only smiled faintly, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't need words. Her eyes held the answer: memory, skill, and sheer will. Her story had begun 6 months earlier, in the scorching August heat of 1887. A wagon rattled into Freeman, Dakota Territory, carrying Anna and her 3 children. Dust clung to everything, the air thick with the smell of dry earth. She had buried her husband in Nebraska just 17 days earlier. Grief weighed heavily on her shoulders, and money weighed just as much. She was a 32-year-old German-Russian immigrant, alone in a foreign land with 3 children and $47 in her pocket. Not enough to buy wood. Not enough to survive the brutal Dakota winters. Her claim came with almost nothing: a 12-by-4 tar paper shanty abandoned after one winter. The walls were so thin that daylight seeped through. The floor was dirt. The iron stove inside barely held a flame. No neighbors within miles, no timber, no understanding from the English-speaking land agent. And yet, she filed her papers anyway. The first neighbor to see her unload her wagon rode over on horseback. John Henderson had buried his daughter in the winter of 1881. He looked at Anna with quiet dread, knowing exactly what the prairie could do. "You can't winter here," he warned. "Not with that stove, not with those walls, not with 3 little ones." "How much wood?" she asked. "8 cords at minimum. 10 to be safe," he said. The numbers crushed hope. Timber hauling alone cost more than she had. Coal would be impossible. Every calculation spelled death. But Anna remembered something Henderson didn't. Back in her grandmother's home in Ukraine, she had learned to fight winter without wood or coal. She had seen Russian masonry stoves burn straw or even manure. A fire that burned fast and hot for 20 minutes could leave walls and floors warm for 20 hours. Warm floors, warm walls, warm nights, even when the wind screamed across the steppe. She had built one herself at 16. She remembered the smell of wet clay, the sun-hard blocks, and her grandmother's hand tracing the warm walls. "This is how our people outsmart the cold," her grandmother had said. Anna had no husband, no money, no proper stove. All she had was knowledge, 2 strong hands, and the will to survive. She chose to build the heater herself, exactly as her grandmother had taught. Weeks passed as Anna dug clay from the creek bank, mixed it with manure, cut straw, and shaped bricks by the hundreds. She laid them out under the open sky to dry. Neighbors whispered and laughed. One woman rode over, staring at the rows of drying bricks. "If that fails in January, your children will die," she warned. Anna's answer was simple: "Then I cannot fail." By October, the stove began to rise, course by course, a maze of smoke channels and clay walls in the center of the shanty. The land agent visited and declared her work inadequate, her survival doubtful. She ignored him. By November, the stove stood finished. Thick clay walls, whitewashed surface, firebox lined with hard-fired brick. The first fire was small, a handful of twisted grass. It burned fast and hot and died quickly. But as the flames went out, the heat lingered. The walls and floor radiated warmth. Her children stopped shivering. The cold of the prairie was no match for memory and craft. When the first real winter arrived in December, Anna fired the stove at dawn and dusk. 20 minutes of flame yielded 20 hours of heat. Her children slept close to the stove, their breath steady in the morning light. Peter's persistent cough eased in the gentle warmth. John Henderson visited once more, eyes wide as he placed a hand on the whitewashed clay. "I'll be damned, it actually works," he said. Anna only nodded, hope she knew should be carried carefully. By the time January rolled around, the stove had proven itself. Snow came and went. Temperatures dropped to 20 below. Inside, it stayed above 50 degrees. And yet the true test of winter had not yet arrived. The first wall of the Arctic storm barreled across the plains, faster and fiercer than anyone had imagined. Anna's children played outside, unaware of the danger approaching. The wind turned wild, carrying frost and death across every empty mile. She called her children in, but Maria, the youngest, ran ahead. The storm struck with sudden ferocity, blinding and crushing. Anna grabbed Katerina and Peter, tied a rope around her waist, and stepped into the void of wind and snow, searching blindly for Maria. Her hands burned, her face stung with ice. Step by step, she followed the rope, calling Maria's name until she heard the faint cry of her child. When she returned to the shanty, all three children safe, the stove glowed, steady and calm. 40 below outside, but inside, life and warmth endured. The men who arrived later could not believe their eyes. Families frozen elsewhere, homes burned for fire, and yet this widow with nothing had survived. They watched as the children played on the glowing floor, Anna baking bread and the clay stove radiating gentle heat. "How?" one whispered again. Anna smiled faintly, as if to say the answer was always simple: knowledge, memory, and courage. January 12, 1888 began like any other cold prairie morning, with the sun barely rising over the snow-covered horizon. Warm air had drifted in from the south, melting the thin layer of frost on Anna's small yard. Her children laughed for the first time in weeks as they ran in circles, snow clinging to their coats, faces pink from the rare warmth. Clothes that had been frozen stiff the night before now dried in the weak morning sun. Anna took a deep breath, feeling a rare moment of relief. No one knew what was coming. Farther north, a massive wall of Arctic air was moving down the plains, faster than anyone had ever seen. At 11 o'clock, Anna looked west and saw the horizon change. Not a cloud, not a shadow, but a wall of white boiling and churning, devouring the blue sky. The wind shifted suddenly, turning from mild to murderous in seconds. She called for her children. Katerina, Peter, Maria, their voices were carried away by the wind. Panic rose inside her like a fire threatening to consume everything. She ran into the whiteout, wrapping a rope around her waist and tying the other end to the shanty. Each step was a fight. Snow burned her cheeks, ice cut her hands, the wind screamed in her ears. 5 steps, 10 steps, 15. Maria, the smallest, was nowhere in sight. "Maria!" Anna shouted, her voice shredded by the storm. The snow blinded her. Then a faint cry, muffled but unmistakable. Her heart leapt. The child was alive. She dug through the drifts with frozen fingers and found Maria curled in a hollow, half-buried, shaking, blue from the cold. Anna lifted her, wrapping her in a blanket. Step by step, hand over hand, she followed the rope back to the shanty. Her legs screamed from exhaustion. Her lungs burned. Her mind barely focused. When she stumbled through the door, Anna leaned against it, heart pounding, pulling in deep breaths of the warm, life-saving air inside. The stove glowed like a beacon, radiating gentle heat into every corner. The children clung to her, tears freezing on their cheeks but their bodies slowly warming against the floor. The first 6 hours were survivable. Anna fed the stove at midnight, again at 4 in the morning. Each fire lasted only 20 minutes, but the clay absorbed the heat and radiated it for hours. The children's small bodies thawed. Peter, who had coughed all through Nebraska, fought the cold-induced fever. Anna boiled snow for water, holding it to his lips, whispering words of strength. "Fight, little one. The heat will help you fight." By the second morning, the blizzard had intensified. The wind sounded alive, screaming across the prairie. Drifts climbed the walls of the shanty. Outside, temperatures fell to 32 below. Inside, the stove kept a steady 51 degrees. Peter's fever climbed, his body burning while the storm raged. Anna worked tirelessly, lighting small fires, tucking blankets around the cracks in walls, creating smaller warm spaces around the stove. Her body ached. Her fingers were raw. Her eyes were raw from sleep deprivation, but she never faltered. On the third day before dawn, Peter's fever finally broke. Anna wept silently beside the stove, her head resting against the warm clay that had saved him. The storm outside weakened slowly, the sky beginning to pale. By evening, the prairie lay buried under mountains of white, but inside the shanty life endured. By January 15th, the rescue party arrived. They had already seen too much death. A Norwegian mother frozen 10 yards from her own door, a child in her arms, families burning furniture and floors to survive. But when they saw no smoke from Anna's chimney, they feared another tragedy. They dug through the drifts and shoved the door open. Warmth poured out a wave against frostbitten faces. The men froze, stepping into the small space. The children played on the earth floor, a pot of rye bread baked in the corner. The clay stove radiated steady heat. Silence fell. "How?" Erickson whispered, stepping closer. Anna did not answer with words. She only smiled faintly, brushing flour from her apron. She understood respect in the silence, the acknowledgement that a widow with nothing had outsmarted the deadliest blizzard the frontier had ever known. 3 days later, the Hendersons arrived on foot, exhausted and frostbitten. Their own home had nearly become their tomb. Their iron stove had gone cold in 12 hours. Their stockpiled wood was buried in drifts they could not reach. Chairs, tables, anything to keep warmth had been burned. Their fingers were wrapped in cloth. Their oldest son still shook from the cold. When they stepped inside Anna's warm shanty, they said nothing at first. Henderson went to the stove, placing his hand on the whitewashed clay. He closed his eyes, feeling heat that seemed impossible. "I thought I understood winter," he whispered, "but I didn't." Anna only nodded. She knew hope had to be carried carefully. Margaret, Henderson's wife, stepped forward. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Teach me how to build one." Anna's smile was small but steady. "Yes, I will teach you." Word spread faster than the storm ever had. Families came from miles away, asking questions, taking notes, tracing the smoke channels with their fingers. The clay bricks once laughed at were now called salvation. The frontier had learned from the widow who refused to freeze. By February, even Deputy Land Agent Charles Whitmore, who had once declared her improvements inadequate, returned. He circled the stove silently, wrote nothing that suggested doubt, and finally said, "Improvements adequate. Claim valid." No apology, but Anna did not need one. Her children were safe, the shanty warm, and the knowledge she carried would save more lives. Spring would bring carpenters, farmers, and brickmakers, replicating Anna's stove for neighbors and strangers alike. A movement had begun, rooted in memory, hard work, and courage. Anna had survived the deadliest winter in Dakota history, and the prairie would remember her not for wealth or land, but for the heat that saved lives, the wisdom that crossed oceans, and the strength of a widow who refused to surrender. Winter stretched on, relentless, testing everyone on the prairie. Yet Anna's shanty remained a pocket of life amid a frozen wasteland. Word of her stove spread from farm to farm. Families who had laughed at her strange clay bricks now traveled miles to study the design. They watched her feed a small fire for 20 minutes, then observed how the heat absorbed into the walls and floor, lasting hours without wood. Husbands, wives, and children marveled at how warmth could survive when the snowstorm raged outside. Anna continued her daily rhythm, rising before dawn to tend the fire, mending her children's clothing and baking bread. Each day was a careful balance between survival and exhaustion. Her hands were calloused from molding bricks, shaping clay, and lifting bundles of straw. Her face was wind-chapped and red from the prairie gusts, but her eyes held a quiet determination that kept the children steady and alive. One morning, Henderson returned, bringing with him a small group of neighbors. They had lost much to the storm. Horses, supplies, even entire homes had been damaged or buried. Yet here, Anna's small shanty radiated comfort. She guided them through her methods, showing how the clay absorbed the heat, how the firebox had to be built, how the channels directed smoke and warmth evenly. Her neighbors listened, some skeptical, others desperate. By the time the lesson ended, a few had already begun sketching plans for their own stoves. But the winter still held its dangers. Storms came suddenly, with the wind tearing across the plains like a living thing. Once in mid-January, a blizzard trapped Anna and the children inside for 3 days straight. Snow piled against the walls, reaching halfway up the windows. Anna fired the stove every 4 hours, keeping the room at a steady 50 degrees while the thermometer outside dropped to 40 below. Peter's cough worsened. His fever climbed again. Anna held him close to the stove, whispering encouragement, boiling snow for water and offering sips carefully. She could feel the heat on her own body, how it crept into her bones. At night, Anna would sit beside the stove, letting its warmth wash over her tired muscles. She reflected on her grandmother in Ukraine, the small lessons passed down through generations, and how they had become more than memories, they were survival. Every brick, every channel of clay was a connection to the past, and now it was a lifeline for the present. The children began to thrive. Katerina, once pale and thin from travel and grief, gained color and energy. Maria, the smallest, no longer cried from cold. Peter's cough eased, replaced by steady breaths and occasional laughter. Anna felt pride but never arrogance. The prairie could still take everything in a single storm, and she respected its power. By the end of January, several families had replicated her stove design. Some succeeded immediately, others struggled, burning small mistakes and starting over. Anna visited, guiding them gently, reminding them that patience was as vital as the clay and straw. People began to call it Anna's stove, though she never sought recognition. She only wanted her children alive and her neighbors safer. One afternoon, a new visitor arrived. He was a man from the nearby town of Turner County, a newspaper reporter curious about rumors of a widow whose home survived the deadliest blizzard. He stood in the doorway, eyes wide as he scanned the children playing, the stove glowing and the warm floor that had once seemed impossible. "Is this true?" he asked. "Did you survive without wood or coal?" Anna nodded, brushing her hair from her face. She spoke slowly, carefully in broken English, but her actions spoke louder than words. She showed him the clay walls, the firebox, the channels that directed the heat, and finally, the floor where her children sat. The reporter scribbled furiously, astonished by the logic and skill behind something so simple yet so revolutionary to the Americans he knew. Winter pressed on into February, the cold easing only slightly. Snowstorms continued, and yet no family who had built Anna's stove reported a death from freezing. The prairie, vast and merciless, had met its match in a widow with memory and courage. Anna continued her work quietly, tending her children, repairing the shanty and guiding others. She never demanded thanks. She had survived for her children, and through them she shared what she knew. The strength of her knowledge traveled farther than she ever imagined. One evening Henderson came once more, older men from the prairie trailing behind him, all carrying gifts of blankets, food, and supplies. They stood silently before the stove. Henderson placed his hand on the clay, eyes closed. "I don't know how you did this," he said. "I thought winter could take everything, but you've outsmarted it." Anna only smiled faintly. The warmth in the room was more than heat, it was hope, and it would endure far beyond that winter. The prairie began to whisper her name. Families traveled from miles away, asking for guidance, bringing children to learn from hers. Even the skeptical land agents stopped by, now witnessing the power of inherited wisdom. Her home, once doubted, had become a sanctuary. Yet Anna knew that each day was borrowed. Every fire, every brick, every ounce of warmth was a reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier. She worked with humility, passing knowledge carefully, never boasting, never forgetting that the winter could still strike, could still challenge her children, could still demand courage she had not yet used. Through it all, Anna taught more than stove building. She taught patience, resilience, and respect for the land. She reminded everyone that survival was not about strength alone. Sometimes it was memory. Sometimes it was courage. Sometimes it was a mother refusing to surrender when everything else seemed lost. As February melted into March, the prairie began to hint at spring, but the cold was far from gone. Anna's children had grown stronger. Katerina's cheeks glowed with health, Peter no longer coughed through the night, and little Maria laughed freely, her energy returning. The stove had proven itself countless times, each fire lasting far longer than any conventional hearth could. Word of her success had traveled even further than she imagined. Families from distant homesteads arrived, sketchbooks and notes in hand, eager to replicate the clay stoves that had saved her children and countless others. Anna spent her days teaching neighbors, demonstrating the delicate balance of clay, straw, and fire. She showed them how to mix the materials until the texture was just right, how to shape the bricks evenly, and how to design the channels so heat would spread evenly. She worked tirelessly, her hands always coated in clay dust, her clothes ragged but functional. Many of the newcomers doubted at first, unsure that such a fragile-looking structure could withstand the prairie winter. But the proof was in her children's warm, healthy faces and the steady warmth radiating from her stove. The Hendersons, whose own home had nearly been lost to frost, returned several times. They had built a stove of their own with Anna's guidance. Seeing their children playing without coats in the warmth, they felt a gratitude deeper than words could express. Henderson often stood quietly, placing a hand on the clay and closing his eyes, feeling the heat that was more than physical. It was a reassurance that life could endure even in the harshest conditions. One particularly fierce storm arrived late in February. Snow whipped sideways across the prairie, and visibility dropped to near zero. Outside, the cold could have frozen a man in minutes. Anna, however, calmly fed the stove, using bundles of grass and straw. The children stayed close, their small bodies warmed by the clay floor. Peter's fever from an earlier cold returned slightly, and Anna's heart tightened. She boiled snow for water, coaxed him to drink, and held him against the warm floor. Each breath he took was a victory. Meanwhile, her neighbors who had built stoves following Anna's design reported similar successes. Families who had been on the brink of despair now survived blizzards that would have once claimed their lives. Mothers taught daughters and sons the techniques, just as Anna had been taught. The knowledge of survival, carried across the ocean and embedded in memory, spread like wildfire across Turner County. The newspaper reporter who had visited weeks earlier published an article detailing Anna's ingenuity and courage. The story of the widow with no wood, no coal, and no conventional stove, who had outsmarted the deadliest winter, captured the imagination of readers across the Dakota Territory. Anna herself did not seek fame. She simply continued her work, tending to her children, repairing her shanty, and helping others. By March, the snow began to retreat, but Anna's life had changed forever. Her small home was no longer just a shelter, it had become a symbol of hope. Families from miles around continued to arrive, learning from her and carrying the knowledge back to their own homesteads. Even the land agents who once doubted her returned, silently observing her methods, taking notes without comment. Her claim remained valid, and her neighbors had learned lessons they would never forget. Anna often stood by her stove in the quiet evenings, watching the children play, listening to the wind outside. Each day reminded her that survival required vigilance. Each fire, each brick, each careful action was proof that life on the prairie could be won, even when the world seemed determined to take it all. She understood the fragility of her success, but she also understood the power of memory and skill. The winter had taken much from the prairie, yet Anna's family had endured. Her grandchildren would later hear stories of the clay stove, the blizzard, and the courage of a mother who refused to give up. And though her name would fade from the prairie over time, the warmth she created, the lessons she shared, and the lives she saved would continue quietly in homes scattered across the plains. Anna's life remained modest. She remarried a kind farmer, raised more children, and lived to see her original stove work for decades. The home she had built, the stove she had crafted with her own hands, had survived the harshest winters and outlived the skeptics who once doubted her. And even as the prairie changed, new homes built, modern furnaces installed, the memory of that small tar paper shanty and the warmth within it endured. Years passed, but Anna's story never faded from the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The winter of 1888 remained one of the deadliest in Dakota Territory history, yet families who had built stoves following Anna's design survived. Her children grew strong, learning the lessons of patience, courage, and ingenuity. Peter recovered fully from his early illnesses, Katerina became a careful and capable young woman, and Maria thrived under her mother's watchful eye. Anna remarried a modest farmer, and together they raised more children. Yet she never stopped teaching, never stopped building, never stopped sharing the old knowledge that had carried them through the worst blizzards. The original stove, the one that had saved her children and countless neighbors, continued to radiate warmth for 40 years. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that ingenuity and determination could outmatch the harshest of winters. The prairie changed around her. New families arrived, farms expanded, modern stoves replaced old methods, but Anna's influence remained. Men and women who had once doubted the power of clay and memory now built stoves inspired by her design. Even Deputy Land Agent Charles Whitmore, who had once declared her work inadequate, returned silently, witnessing the thriving home she had created. He never apologized, but the warmth of Anna's success needed no words. By 1934, Anna passed away at 79. Her gravestone carried a simple German inscription, a tribute to a woman who had learned to stay warm, to survive, and to teach. The small tar paper shanty and the great clay stove were gone, replaced by fields and new homes, yet the legacy remained. Every family that gathered around a fire, every homestead that built a stove with care, carried forward the lessons of that winter. Anna's story lived on in the whispers of the prairie, in the warmth of homes that would never forget her, in the generations who learned that survival often came not from strength alone, but from memory, courage, and wisdom passed through time. A widow with no wood, no coal, no proper stove, and no chance had outsmarted the deadliest winter the frontier had ever seen. And the floor beneath her children had stayed warm at 40 below, proving that hope, skill, and determination could conquer even the harshest cold. Her name may have faded from the maps and the town records, but the warmth she created, the lives she saved, and the lessons she passed on endure quietly wherever cold threatens, wherever courage is needed, and wherever memory becomes the key to survival.